Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Schumacher, and I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs for the Mob Museum. Thank you for tuning in to our virtual series called Writing the Mob, Chronicling Organized Crime in the 20th Century. This is the fifth of 6 virtual programs we are holding this spring and summer, focused on authors who have written new books about organized crime history. The first 4 programs can be viewed on the Mob Museum's YouTube channel. It's a pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's program. They are Marilyn Greenwald and Eunice Lee, authors of Eunice Carter, A Lifelong Fight for Social Justice. When you see the title of their book, you may not immediately think of organized crime history, but rest assured the connection is there. In fact, it's safe to say that Eunice Carter was a pivotal figure in law enforcement efforts to bring down the mob in the 20th century. Marilyn Greenwald is a professor emeritus of journalism at Ohio University and the author of 4 biographies. Eunice Lee is a reporter for CNBC covering Wall Street, as well as presidential elections and pandemics, nothing big. She has a master's degree in journalism from Ohio University. The Mob Museum's Director of Public Programs, Shakayla Alvarenga, will serve as our moderator for today's program. Take it away, Shakayla.
Jeff, thank you. And thank you to all of those who are joining us on our live stream, Facebook, YouTube as well. Marilyn Greenwald and Eunice Lee, it is a pleasure to host you on this platform this afternoon. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as Jeff mentioned, we are approaching the 85th anniversary of the Lucky Luciano conviction. I've been looking forward to this program for a while because Eunice Carter has always been such a fascinating character to me in mob history. So I'll give you the floor for just a few minutes to talk about your latest book.
Okay, thank you. So what we wanted to do is, before we do a brief kind of discussion of how we came up with this idea, we wanted to show you some photos in the book, which we'll probably go through as we're talking, but just so you get an idea of who's who. So obviously this is the cover, and we can go to the next slide. People probably know this is Lucky Luciano. He's pretty famous, so there he is. Next slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. And this is his nemesis.
Yes. This is Thomas Dewey, who was appointed as the special prosecutor in 1935 by the governor of New York to spearhead this grand investigation into organized crime in New York City.
Can you go to the next one? Go ahead, you. Just
this was a front page story in the Amsterdam News. This is where they announced that Eunice Carter was hired by Dewey to his investigation team, and she was the only Black, only female lawyer and investigator on that team. And a lot of newspapers had run stories on this appointment.
Okay. And there, we're trying to figure out, I think that was probably, that one on the left is probably from when she was first appointed. I think you and I decided. And the one on the right of Eunice is, I think she's a little bit older than after, after she probably entered private practice. Mm-hmm. You can do this one.
This is Koki Flo. She was, so the investigation was mainly on a prostitution ring in New York City. And she was a very famous prostitute back then, and she gave the pivotal testimony against Luciano in this very sensational trial. We'll talk about that later.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, this is front page in the New York Daily News about Luciano and 8 of his co-defendants found guilty. This is just all the pictures and headshots of all the mob figures. Very interesting coverage. Yes.
This is Addie Hunton, who was Eunice Carter's mother in France during World War I. And you might say, well, why was she in France during World War I? Which we'll get to when we talk about her. She was really an amazing woman. You and I say that somebody actually should do a book on her, but we will talk about her a little bit later. So. And this is on the left, it's Stanton Hutton, as it says, Eunice's grandfather, and her father, William Hutton, on the right. We're going to talk more about them, and there's stories interesting too, especially Stanton, and I'll just kind of give you a teaser here. He was a slave who purchased his own freedom, and that in itself, as if that weren't enough. I mean, there's more to his story. And her father, they were Canadian. Stanton obviously was, he was a slave. He was born in the United States, but when he bought his freedom, he moved to Canada. And William was born and raised in Canada. So there's also that Canadian link, which I think is pretty interesting, and we'll learn more about that. Eunice's yearbook photo 1921. She went to Smith College. And you can imagine, without even realizing, 1921, there were not a lot of Black women at Smith then. And she graduated with 2 degrees, a master's and a bachelor's at the same time. She definitely was an overachiever. So. Go ahead.
This is a very famous photo of Harry Truman, the Democratic presidential candidate in 48. And so this is the front page of Chicago Daily Tribune. Dewey defeats Truman, just to show you, this was a huge upset. Everybody thought Dewey was going to win. He got it, but he lost just by a little bit.
Okay. So that kind of gives you an overview of what we're going to talk about. But we just for 5 minutes, we want to talk about how we got this idea, only because I think it's kind of strange. And I've done other books, and I really have never gotten an idea for a book quite like this. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a long story, but we will condense it. I got the idea, I think, as we alluded to, during a trip to the Mob Museum that I took with my family. I think it was 2013 or 14, and we loved it. It was fascinating, but we were in the room with the famous 1936 mob trial, and all the details of it. And along the wall were these black and white photos of the team of 20 of New York's best attorneys and their kind of chief, Tom Dewey, and they were responsible for this prosecution of Lucky Luciano and his henchmen, and nobody had ever really prosecuted, a mobster for a felony. They got him for minor crimes. Al Capone famously for tax evasion, but this was the first time, and it was called at the time the trial of the century. Anyway, so there were all these attorneys, along the wall, individual pictures, and they were young-looking guys, kind of, handsome, kind of nasty looking, and we're looking at them all, and they're about the 7th or 8th one is this woman, and she was kind of demure looking, Black woman, and she just, my family and I are looking at each other like, wow, there's got to be a story behind that, only because without even knowing how many women were even attorneys then. I mean, as our book says, we give the number, there weren't many. How many Black women were attorneys? Of course, even less. So I tucked it away in my brain, and I said, this might be something to look at. I was working on another project. 3 or 4 years later, I'm starting a new project. I thought, let me look into that. So I contacted the Mob Museum, and I said, what was this woman's name? And I described it to somebody there, and they emailed me back, and they said it was Eunice Hutton Carter. And not only was she a member of this team, she was the one that clinched the case. She was the one that made the link between prostitution and the mob. And without that link, they may not have gotten their conviction. And it was Eunice, and we're going to describe later how she did that, who did this. So that was great. And I thought, well, this might be worth, pursuing. Unfortunately, I thought it was very interesting, but Eunice didn't leave any papers. Of course, she was born in 1899, so there were no contemporaries. They all had died. And I was beginning to think, it's interesting maybe for a magazine article. There had been some newspaper stories done on her, but nothing maybe for a book. And at that point, I was talking to Ewan, who at the time was my graduate assistant, and I said, she's kind of interesting. Do a little more research on her, and I'll let Ewan describe it briefly. But what Ewan found out, that she actually was a writer, that when she was in her 20s, she lived in Harlem and was actually part of the great Harlem Renaissance of writers and artists. And she had written for a magazine called Opportunity, and she did fiction reviews. Anyway, one thing led to another. So we thought, well, she's not just an attorney, she's a writer. And then you can say tell some of the other research that you found that that persuaded us.
Right. We knew that Eunice and Thomas Dewey worked together for a couple of years. And we were very interested in obviously doing research about journalism history. And then I actually went to Dewey's archives in Rochester, New York. And I looked at all of his papers, his correspondence with newspaper editors, and also oral history written by his biographer back then. And I kind of realized that he was kind of a PR genius. He was able to cultivate relationship with editors and reporters from the biggest newspapers in New York City. And interestingly enough, all of them actually listened to him, and they kept quiet when Dewey asked them to keep quiet. And before the Luciano trial, the media really portrayed Luciano as this public enemy, as this big villain figure in a very sensationalized way, which in turn raised Dewey's profile. So this is also a very interesting case study, just from a PR and journalism perspective. And we just thought the story just kept getting richer and richer, and more than enough material for a book. Yeah. I
can imagine when you started digging that at each way that you went, it was just more and more interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, many people, as we know Eunice Carter as maybe the first Black woman prosecutor in, the Manhattan prosecutor's office. But what I really love about your book is you delve a lot into how she became that way, how she became kind of this fearless fighter. And that started with her social justice work. So let's talk about her role in the United Nations and beyond as well.
Okay, yeah. We're going to talk about Eunice's mother in a bit, but I do want to, offer a tidbit here. Her mother was very active near the end of the 19th century in the women's club movement. And there's a women's club movement, there's a Black women's club movement. And what the women's club movements were, they were actually public policy organizations, and they were groups of women who got together to affect public policy, to affect legislation. And sometimes, we think of women's clubs today as social, let's get together for tea type things. And they were much, much more, and I'm not putting that down, I'm just saying these were serious women. They donated their time, and it was just, hours, weeks, months, years of time. And Eunice's mother was instrumental in these. She worked for women's suffrage. She worked for civil rights. You have to remember too, in this era, women couldn't vote. So, they couldn't vote. So you can imagine they did not have a lot of power, legislatively. So one of the only ways to get power was through these groups. They made contacts with each other. We would call it networking today. Eunice's mother was Addie. She was a wonderful writer. She wrote for a lot of publications of the era. Some still exist, the Crisis, NAACP publication, which is pretty well known, and others. And she did a lot and influenced her daughters. So Eunice was almost born into this kind of feeling like you have to work for the betterment of society. And also Addie pretty much either directly or indirectly taught Eunice, you have to write things down, because otherwise there'll be no record, particularly for women and minorities. And Addie was very smart and certainly, knew this. A lot of people didn't. So that's how, Eunice was involved in this much of her life. Now, after she worked for New York she worked for, obviously, she worked, in her prosecutor's office job, but for 9 years after the trial, when she went into private practice, that's when she really accelerated her efforts. And, and this is in the book, so I'll condense it. She got to know through the women's club movement, people who were actually part of FDR's cabinet. They got, Eleanor Roosevelt in particular, got to know many of the people in the Black Women's Club movement. And this is how Eunice kind of got to know those people. And at the beginning of the United Nations in the mid-40s, she played a role in providing some legal assistance. She did not work for the United Nations per se, but she provided legal assistance. She was instrumental in meeting a lot of the people there, a lot of the people who made it possible. I was listening to an interview between Eleanor Roosevelt and Eunice. Eleanor had a radio show and she interviewed Eunice. It was really fascinating, but it just speaks to her clout, you know, and she got this step by step through her contacts and just providing service. And this was just about all voluntary. And she was honored several times by these various women's groups. I mean, I have letters of congratulations and thanks and everything that I've seen. So that's what it was pretty much throughout her whole life.
Mm. And you said that her grandfather had quite the story too at the very beginning.
Yeah, Stanton Hutton was his name, and we had the picture of him. That's one of my favorite pictures. There's something about that picture that I really like that we showed at the beginning of Stanton. And he purchased his own freedom, traveled to Canada, and you have to remember, and sometimes we forget, even at the time, he purchased his own freedom, but he still could be caught and returned, you know, so it was not safe for him or anybody in his position at the time. So he went to Canada, safe haven. And this is what I find so fascinating. He moved to a little community called Chatham, which is, we visited there. There's a museum that's really interesting if you want to know more. That's where the picture came from. It's about driving, it's about an hour and a half north of Detroit. And it was kind of this enclave for escaped slaves, people like Stanton Hutton, and they developed this great little community. It was this artsy community, and they became businessmen, and it was really fascinating. It's all in this museum in Chatham. And Stanton became quite well-to-do. I mean, I don't want to say he was wealthy, but he carved out a life for himself. He started owning businesses, and he had 9 children, and William to the right was one of them, and that was her father, William Hutton, who in his own right, and I'll just give a couple of sentences on him, he was, as a young man, he loved the YMCA in Canada, and he became active in it. And they asked him to join the International YMCA in Canada, and they were attempting to integrate the Ys in the United States. So when he was a young man, so this was in the, probably late, 1800s, he was sent to the South, the U.S., the South, the Jim Crow South, to integrate the YMCAs. And that, you can imagine, that was quite a job. He really is, he's very much respected. He's now, even today, considered one of the top officials of the International YMCA. And he was, it was interesting. I read his letters. I've read a lot of his letters there at Howard University of what he encountered in the Jim Crow South. You can imagine, as a young man trying to integrate the Ys. But he was very spiritual. He was very optimistic. His letters were always upbeat, even though you can imagine what he went through. But anyway, so yes, she comes from quite an impressive family. And we've only told you a very small part of it. So.
Right. And the book does delve a lot more into it. I really would recommend it to people. Let's talk about the case that really put her on the map. The Lucky Luciano case. So first, I'm interested to hear, how did Thomas Dewey learn about Carter and her work?
Okay, yeah, what happened was, in a nutshell, after Eunice graduated with degrees in sociology and political science from Smith. She was a social worker. Then in her early 30s, she went to night school at Fordham Law, got a degree. So she had a husband and a child at this point. She was going to night law school working, had a family. She graduates. She lived in Harlem, and I think I said she was active in the whole Harlem Renaissance. She was a known figure there. Well, unfortunately, and I believe it was in 1935, I was just looking in my notes. Yeah, in 1935, this was a couple years after she got her law degree. There was a terrible, terrible riot in the Harlem, injuries, some deaths, terrible. And the city of New York, it wanted to find out what happened, not what triggered it, but in the bigger picture. So Fiorello LaGuardia, the famous mayor, got together a biracial 11-person panel, and we want to know, why did this happen? And he kind of knew, the people in Harlem knew Eunice, so they said, well, she should not just be on it, she should be the secretary, which means she gathers everything. She's kind of like the quarterback of the thing. And she did such a fantastic job, as you can imagine, because she's an overachiever. She organized it. She got a lot of information. They came up with a report that said essentially it's because of a poor education system in the area, of poor housing. And now that sounds like, well, of course that was it. But back then, that people didn't know. It was like, wow, that's a revelation. She not only came up with that, she lobbied in the New York, in the State House in New York, and she helped get 7 laws passed, and because of this. And so, there were stories written about her. So this caught Dewey's eye, and Dewey, who was very smart, very clever, said, this is somebody who knows what they're doing. So she had been working, at that point, she'd been working as prosecutor in what was called women's court. And Yoon could talk more about that. But then she was there, and it was then that Dewey was putting together his team. He was special prosecutor. Then he said, this person, we got to have her on the team. And you can take it away after what happened after that. But
yeah, I can talk a little bit about, the crime scene in New York City back then and how Luciano really came into the picture. So by the early 1930s, organized crime really had already become very prevalent in New York City. We've all seen those kind of gangster movies. We know what it looks like, just how powerful can the mob be. So back then they were organized in different neighborhoods in Manhattan and other parts of New York, but they were never under the same umbrella. So like the Irish mob would lead the West Side, the Jewish and Italian gangsters control the East Side, that kind of thing. So, and it was very widespread. It affected everybody's daily lives because the mob ran different rackets and they charged very high sales tax on everything from, your daily grocery items like vegetables, flour, to gasoline, to cars. And this is where Luciano really came into the picture. He very quickly became this leading figure of the mob, of the underworld in New York, because he came in and he said, if we want to go big, different groups, we have to work together instead of against each other. We have to, avoid conflicts, between each other and the turf wars and really try to maximize their profits. So he kind of proposed a structure where, the Irish, Jewish, and Italian gangsters, they come together and work under one umbrella. So, and it worked. They got bigger and they got more organized. And the police, the law enforcement, they've been trying for years to crack down the crime scene in New York, but it was just almost impossible because just how many people in the government were actually corrupt. So every time somebody tries to investigate, the mob would get tipped off. Just nobody would even try to touch it for the longest time. And then by 1935, the governor of New York back then, Herbert Lehman, he decided that he was going to appoint a special prosecutor and really try to crack down organized crime because it just got so out of control. And he appointed Thomas Dewey, and they decided that the way to really clinch this case is to investigate prostitution, which was controlled by the mob. And Eunice actually made the vital link between prostitution and the mob, which I'll talk about later. And then they estimated that there were, 2,000 prostitutes employed in more than 200 houses in New York City. It was wild.
Yeah. And so this massive prostitution ring that was happening in New York City, you mentioned it employed 2,000 prostitutes, thousands of prostitutes. So what role did Carter play in taking it down? How did she kind of make that connection?
Yeah, so before Eunice got hired by Dewey, she was working at Manhattan's Women's Court, where she dealt with a lot of prostitution cases. And back then, she discovered something very suspicious, because many of the prostitutes who were brought into her office all had the same attorney, same people who bailed them out, and almost none of them got out of all of them got out of trouble. So
also one quick, and they didn't have any money yet. The attorneys were expensive,
very expensive. So yeah, and then they all tell the same story of how they were new to the city and they didn't know anything. So it was just too similar. And the same attorney, same people who got them out, right? So this is very suspicious. And Eunice kind of thought that this money might have been coming from the mob, and the prostitutes, nearly all of them were able to got out of trouble and avoided going to jail. So, and actually when Eunice brought her theory to Dewey, he was very hesitant at first. He didn't believe it. He didn't want his team to be associated with, prostitutes and the sex industry. But then Eunice did more digging. She went to women's court, digging through old court documents, old dockets, and she found the names and the address of the prostitutes' lawyers and the people who paid their bail. And additionally, she started interviewing a lot of people who sent letters to Dewey's team. They sent complaints and tips. And she was talking to a lot of people, and she managed to identify some of the main bookers in this prostitution ring. And then, the evidence just became too strong for Dewey to ignore. And they, they decided that they were going to look very closely and focus on prostitution in New York in order to prosecute the mob.
Mm. And this was, obviously a massive enterprise that they were all running. I believe I read they were turning in about $1 million a month for this business. So can you talk to me a little bit more about how the inner workings of this racket kind of worked, how they were able to pull this off for as long as they did?
Yeah, it was really crazy. So the mob, they would recruit girls from small towns, sometimes from homeless shelters. It was really sad. And they put them in different houses every week. So, and how the mob was able to make money was, let's say, if a girl made $300 a week, and she had to pay half of it to the madam and 10% to the booker, and then $5 to the doctor. So now she only has $130. And then she had to pay $30 to $35 a week for what's called a bond, which is kind of a guarantee, kind of an insurance system, so that the mob promised that no prostitutes would ever go to jail. They would use the bond money to bail them out. And this bond fee actually was the main revenue source for Luciano and his team, his men, his prostitution ring. Mm-hmm. So now, if this girl, her weekly gross income was $300, and now all she had left to herself was $100. So the mob would take 2/3 of each prostitute's income. So that's how the money snowballed, and they were able to make $1 million a month.
Wow.
It was wild. Yeah.
I'm interested to hear how Eunice Carter and Thomas Dewey got along, because from what I've read, Carter had this more low-key personality. She had kind of a quiet demeanor, and then Dewey was kind of a showman. He, essentially loved the spotlight. So why do you think they got along so well, and how their differences maybe helped with the prosecution of this case?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think they were really quite fond of each other. I mean, Eunice was low key, but she had, I gather from, what I've read, she had a kind of a quiet authority. I gather that her demeanor was, hey, she knows what she's doing, and she conveyed that. And Dewey was very charismatic. Dewey, a lot of people don't know this, but he actually trained to be a singer. He went to University of Michigan and had no real plans to be an attorney. He ended up he met a woman who was also in music, and they ended up getting married, but she went to New York to study, and he followed her, ended up going to law school. That's how he became an attorney. It was almost something that wasn't planned, but he was a showman, and he literally was. But as you said, I think that in a weird way, their differences were complementary. But one thing, they were both brilliant. I mean, they were just two brilliant people. I think a lot of times, brilliant people are attracted to other brilliant people. They know they want to work with them. And sometimes maybe it doesn't work because of their personalities. In this way, I think they were both so smart, and they were both hardworking. I mean, I have to say, from what you and I found, both Dewey and Eunice were workaholics. They were. That's what their life was for most of their life. And so I think they shared this brilliance. They were both workaholics. They were both single-minded in what they were doing. So they really were, in a bizarre way, alike. And they were also, they weren't super religious, but they were spiritual people. Their religion did mean something to them. So there were minor things like that kind of, were similar. In the book, we talk about in a couple pages about, you wouldn't think that these two people were like, just because of their background and everything else, but they actually were, and so, one thing led to another, and that's, I guess that's how history is made. I mean, you have to wonder, and we'll never know, if he didn't get Eunice on his team, would they ever have thought that the mob was linked to prostitution? I mean, they might have 20 years later or something, but would they have thought then that the mob was linked to prostitution? Because that's what really, really clinched it. So yeah, it is. It's like any two people who work together. Sometimes it's a real interesting kind of combination, so.
Definitely. And as we kind of move through this story, so Luciano at the time, he was, I would say, the most powerful, racketeer in the country. So for those who don't know what the verdict was, can you kind of take us through that trial and how many years in prison he actually served?
Yeah, he was found guilty of compulsory prostitution, and he was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in jail. I'm not going to spoil it, but that's not the amount of time he ended up serving.
He served, 10 years? Is that what it was?
I think 7 to 8 years.
Was it? It was less.
Yeah.
So the question is, what happened, right? Let me guess, Shakayla, that's your next question. No, well, this is what's really kind of strange and intriguing, and there's a main story on this. There's different details. You and I have found different stories, but I mean, the main thread of this is the same, and that is he's serving his time. And this, just as a side note, this propelled Dewey to fame. He became the nation's biggest crime fighter. He was a household name, and it really made Eunice pretty well known in New York. She was quite well known and even outside of New York, but mostly New York. So this really propelled these people into fame. So he's serving his time, and the World War II breaks out, and everybody kind of thought at the time that organized crime still kind of ran the docks, the New York harbor. You know, it was just kind of this thing that people knew. And apparently Navy intelligence got it in their minds that there were a lot of Italian immigrants that were dock workers. And they were afraid that there could be sabotage, that maybe these people were sympathetic to Hitler, maybe they'd be sympathetic to Mussolini. And they were worried about this. Mm-hmm. And they knew that the mob had still had a hand in the dock workers. So it was Governor Lehman. It wasn't, you know, Dewey later became governor. He was not governor at this time. Governor Lehman apparently, because people have different versions of the story, made a deal with organized crime and said, hey, if you can tell us there'll be no sabotage. If you prove to us everything's going to be fine, you'll tell your people not to, sabotage it. We will free Luciano when the war is over. And at this point, Dewey was governor. He was a 3-term governor. He had been governor. And so lo and behold, they said, well, the war is over. Nothing happened. We want him free. And so Dewey said he didn't make the agreement, but that was the agreement. So they deported him to Italy. They said, you cannot come back here. He wanted to come back. Luciano loved the United States. He wanted to come back, even though he was a kind of a very well-known guy, kind of, I don't want to say hero, but people liked him in Italy, but he wanted to come back. They said, absolutely not. If you come back, you're going to be arrested. So he didn't serve anywhere near his time. A lot of people don't know that. I didn't know that. He died in Italy, but he came back to the United States because this is what you and I find so amusing. He came back because he asked to be buried in St. John Cemetery in the Queens, where a lot of mob figures were buried. So he did come back, and that is where he was buried in Queens. And the final irony is he's buried, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 rows away from a guy he put a hit on. It was his former boss when he was a young mobster, and he put a hit on his boss. And they're all both buried, within close proximity of each other in St. John cemeteries. So he got closure, I guess.
I guess so. Well, even after the trial too, I mean, Dewey and Carter, they still kept in contact afterwards, right?
Yeah, in fact, she helped him on all his campaigns, his gubernatorial campaigns, 3-time governor, his presidential campaign too, which, as Ewan alluded to, Dewey was a shoo-in. I mean, everybody thought he was going to win. I mean, it was like, every poll, we found editorial cartoons saying, hey, why even go and vote? Dewey's going to win. Well, he didn't. And it was that famous, if you could show that famous headline, which, is iconic, the whole Dewey defeats Truman, because the newspapers were so sure that he was going to win. But no, they remained friends. Ewan and I found letters in various archives between them, and they were very friendly. I mean, they were, just you could tell they were friends. They were not super informal, but it's something you would write a friend, somebody you've known for 20 years, even though they were business related. She would help him trying to get, the black vote, and with a lot of other things too. So yes, they were quite devoted to each other. One of my friends said to me, boy, if Dewey got to be president, do you think that she would have been in the cabinet? And it's a good question. We'll never know. But I thought she would certainly be high up in the administration, I think, if he ever were president. So.
And so we have a few questions from some people watching online, and they're good questions, so I want to try and get through some of these. So one person asked, Stephen Carter, Eunice's grandson, also wrote a book about her, and they asked if you talked with Stephen about your book, and how does your book differ from his?
Okay, well, here's why I'm laughing. We had our book contract, and we were about halfway through our book when we learned that Stephen had a book coming out in about 6 months. So it was one of these, oh my God, moments. We had planned to talk to him. I had contacted him right at the very, very beginning of this, but not to the stage where we made plans to talk. And then 3 years later, we're doing our other research, and we see just books coming out about Eunice Carter. And of course, after each of us had a heart attack, our book actually was delayed for about a year because of this. It actually was supposed to come out last year. I'm kind of glad that it came out now, but it was supposed to. And I will tell you, I got his book. I liked his book. His book was well, first of all, just from what we're talking about here, he did have much less on the Luciano trial. It was much more a minor part of his book. He was her grandson, so he focused on a lot of their personal relationships, a lot about Eunice and Addie, their personal relationship. We have some of that in our book. To be honest, we don't have a lot. He has a lot more on the details of what her life was like in Harlem, the weddings she went to. We have some of that. We don't have a lot of that. He has much less on Stanton and William. Not very much. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just that these are how the books are different.
Mm-hmm.
We have less on her personal relationships. In fact, most of what we have about a relationship with her mother comes from Stephen. It comes from his book. So the answer is no, we didn't talk to him, but after the book, we would have asked him about these personal relationships, which is what he dealt with extensively in his book. So that's a good question.
Another person asked, based on your research of the trial, do you think the prosecutors proved that Luciano was the kingpin of prostitution in New York? Some have questioned whether they really made the link to Luciano.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, because back then there was a lot of controversy around the use of prostitutes as material witnesses during the trial, because, a lot of them were drug addicts. People don't think they are credible, and some of them even fainted on the stand. So it's kind of controversial to use. I think Dewey used more than 100 prostitutes as witnesses during this trial. But I think one of the big things that Dewey was trying to achieve was to prove that this is in fact a racket, this is organized, right? So the key thing is to show them, to really break down this revenue structure, where they get this money from. And as I mentioned before, how much percentage they extracted from each prostitute, and just to show that this is really organized compulsory prostitution. So I think, the answer is yes. They really made the link to Luciano as this mob boss of this prostitution ring.
One other thing, and I can address this or you can, and it's peripherally related to this question about, and you might have mentioned it in passing, Ewan, but about this whole image, what Dewey wanted to do was have a face of the mob, because the mob was the mob, all these people, and people didn't understand it. So he really did. Wouldn't you say he purposely made Luciano the villain? I'm not saying that he wasn't the linchpin, but he was smart enough to know you got to have a face for the mob. And so talk a little bit about how Luciano was perfect for this role.
Right. Actually, the media, the press played a huge part of that too, because actually before Dewey's investigation and before this big trial, Luciano wasn't very well known in public. He was only known in the underworld. It was Dewey who cultivated relationships with all the editors and reporters. And he gave, addresses and interviews saying Luciano was public enemy number one. Mm-hmm. He was, really horrendous, running, huge rackets, making millions and millions of dollars a year. And then the newspaper started to write stories on Luciano's background and his extravagant lifestyle. People got really interested in Luciano, and he really became this, really big villain. And it's really genius because, Dewey needed a big figure to take down in order to make himself the hero, So I think it's interesting to see how it was jarring because, I saw his mails, his correspondence with newspaper editors. He had lunches with the editor-in-chief of New York Times back then. It was crazy to see how, everybody was very willing and open to, cooperate. And, they basically were saying, our op-ed age is at your disposal. You can do whatever you want, just say a word. We'll do whatever coverage as you like, which it will be considered a conflict of interest, of course, right now. So that part of the book was also very interesting.
One thing that you and I talked about, during the Mueller investigation a couple years ago, if you remember that, there was all this talk of leaks, like, oh, no, they won't leak, Mueller's people don't leak, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And this is the thing that Dewey was so worried about. He didn't want them to be doing their investigation and getting leaks to the press. Mm-hmm. So this is why, as you were saying, he found it so vital to curry favor with the press, because he as long as he said, hey, don't leak, we'll give you everything you want when we're done, et cetera, et cetera. And so they didn't. So he really, when the Mueller investigation was going on, we were kind of chuckling because Dewey kind of had that same, you can't have the newspapers and the media, printing things about or running things about your investigation.
Mm. And I think a good point that Ewan had made beforehand was how Dewey was able to kind of turn Luciano into a household name, really before this historic trial went down. So by the time that the trial happened, well,
Yeah. And, it's funny because he, in his own way, he was kind of this handsome guy, I mean, he had the craggy face. And, he had a droopy eyelid, and, we've been reading in mob histories about how he got that, and of course, some violent way. So that, he was this kind of made to order criminal. He was handsome, yet he had scars, which indicate that he had a violent lifestyle. So in a weird way, he was kind of from central casting, for Dewey. Just pretty much by the way he looked.
Mm-hmm.
So
this next question, you've touched upon it kind of throughout the program, but if you want to elaborate a little bit more, someone said, how did you research Eunice's story, since she lived many years ago and probably many of the people around her at that time have passed away on now, like current family members or documented history?
We can both address this. I want to say I'm glad this question was asked, because I about 5 minutes ago, I was just realizing that I had not talked about Addie's Hunton trip. I mentioned Addie Hunton's trip to France, but didn't elaborate on it. And I don't know, Jackie, if you've got that picture of Addie. Yeah. What happened when her children were late teens? So her husband had died. William had died. And I think Eunice was starting college, and her other son, Alpheus, was 2 years younger. So anyway, her children were grown. And she volunteered through the YMCA with a couple other women to give aid to Black troops at the end of World War I in France. And she wrote a book on it. And it was just this riveting book, which is research. I mean, that's one way we learned about her. I think it was about a year or so in France. And what was interesting about this was it was so very detailed, because she wrote it shortly after she got back. But she talks about how these troops these Black troops in France, the French treated them relatively well. It was actually the U.S. government, and I don't want to say their fellow troops, but the people in charge, the Americans, who really discriminated against them. I mean, they were fighting for their country, yet they couldn't go into certain restaurants. There were bands playing, and the Black soldiers weren't allowed in there. I mean, and there were many, as you can imagine, many examples of this. So this in itself is history. She knew it was important to write down exactly what she saw, which provided a great record of what was going on with the Black troops, in France. And she volunteered with 2 or 3 other women, and that in itself was pretty dangerous, as you can imagine. But anyway, I wish we had a better picture of Addie. I mean, that came from the Y, and which is very nice of them to give us, but I wish we had a better picture. Anyway, Ewan, why don't we don't know, we didn't talk to a lot of people because of her contemporaries, as I said, because they are not around anymore. But Ewan, you want to address some of the archives? We relied heavily on archival
Yeah, we rely heavily
material.
on, yes, primary archival material. I went to Rochester, New York, to look at Dewey's papers. And I also spent a lot of time in New York City Municipal Archive, where they house all the documents and records of the Luciano trial. So there's all these transcripts of, this trial that went on for a week, more than a week, actually. So a lot of digging through those materials. And you also did you go to Smith College? Did you get some?
Well, we did. I didn't go to Smith for this, but we got her yearbook photo, but we also got her, and I'm chuckling, we got her senior thesis from Smith, and I have it. It's this detailed, she kind of redid city government. She took a city and said this would be a better way to structure the city government. And it was like the most detailed thing I'd ever seen on city government.
That's incredible.
Isn't that? And this was a student. She graduated. So I didn't go to Smith, but Smith sent me that. And actually the cover of the book was from Smith too, because they gave her an honorary degree. I can't remember the year, but it was well after the trial. They gave her an honorary degree, and I think she had that picture taken for Smith that's on the cover of the book, which is a beautiful picture. And I think I mentioned briefly, I went to Howard University because that's where Williams' papers are. So we have a lot of papers, letters, etc., from between William and Addie. William and Addie were wonderful writers because he was on the road a lot. She helped him sometimes, but once she had the two children, she really couldn't go on the road with him much. They probably wrote each other, if not every day, almost every day. And these letters were, you can imagine, they were so well written. They were beautifully written. So that offered a glimpse into their early life and William's job with the YMCA and everything, that entailed. So there was that. Oh, yes. The Black Mecca Museum in Chatham, Ontario. That's the museum where I got the wonderful picture from Stanton Hunt. But it's also, it's a wonderful chronicle of this beautiful city, this wonderful little city where a lot of these escaped slaves built their lives. Some of them became abolitionists, including Stanton. I would recommend, going there. And even if you're in Detroit for something else, like I said, it's like an hour and a half drive from Detroit. And I will put in a plug for the woman who runs this museum. She's wonderful. Mm-hmm. She's just a nice person, and she's very good at what she does. There are, beyond just Eunice, they have things like they have shackles. Wow. If you're interested in the history of slavery and just the brutality of it, it's a wonderful history lesson on top of everything else. So it's called the Black Mecca Museum in Chatham, Ontario.
One thing I'll add is we also looked at a ton of newspapers, not just in New York City, but nationally, just to look at, how the media covered the trial, covered the investigation, and how much they mentioned Eunice, how much they wrote about her and her role in the investigation. So newspaper coverage was also a huge part of our research as well.
Right. Another person asked, what kind of legal work did Eunice do in private practice?
Wow, that's a good question. I will be honest and say I don't know quite the answer, but I do know that she donated a lot of her legal work. Now, I said, we talked about the United Nations. She served as a legal advisor to them. She also I think she did not work for the United Nations. She got paid for her time. Where she did not get paid for her legal time was she was the longtime legal advisor of one of the the groups that I mentioned, the women's groups. For decades she provided legal work for them. So she was very generous with giving her time for the the movements that she believed in. So I'm sorry, yeah, I can't. Unfortunately, that one's got me a little stymied. So.
And one last question for you. Now that you've dipped your toes into the engrossing work of organized crime history, and the both of you can answer this separately too, do you have plans to collaborate on another book in this area, or what are you working on right now?
And I'll let you go.
Actually, I'm not sure if I'll ever be lucky enough to work on another book. Yeah, it's actually, so I've just been really busy with my work. I, cover the markets, a lot of things going on in that arena. And I know, Dr. Greenwald, you started your next project already. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes and no. I believe it or not, I am interested in this, but I'm also interested in animal activists. Mm-hmm. I think they're intriguing. I did write a book in 2009 about Cleveland Amory, who was an arts critic turned animal activist. But since 2009, so much has happened, in the world of animals and pets, and there are pet psychiatrists. And I was reading, I think there's pet astrologers now. The Wall Street Journal did a story on animal astrologers, and you can imagine it's animal everything. So I thought, I don't know yet, but I'm kind of interested in maybe continuing that. It really doesn't have a lot to do with, I guess, with Lucky Luciano. But,
just go in a completely different direction.
I was going to say, maybe they wore a lot of fur then, right? Maybe. Luciano probably wore fur because we were reading about his $1,000 suits and his $100 shoes and
there's some connection there.
Yeah, so we can make some connection, I guess. But, no, it is a good question though. But
well, thank you. I do look forward to watching you both and your next projects, and we really do appreciate you for joining us for the last hour and writing this incredible book about Eunice and all of the work that she did, over the years that she worked this trial. So thank you, Yoon Lee and Marilyn Greenwald, for joining us for this virtual author talk series with the Mob Museum. We appreciate you hopping on, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.